My husband left me at the airport in rain. He froze when the airline CEO picked me up in luxury car. The boarding announcement echoed through Terminal C as I clutched our boarding passes with trembling fingers. 5 years of marriage, and this was supposed to be our fresh start. Our anniversary getaway to Hawaii. The trip I'd saved for months to afford, cutting corners on everything from groceries to gas just to book us those economy seats. Ava, seriously? Middle seats. Chris's voice cut through the airport noise like a knife. He didn't even try to lower his tone as other passengers turned to stare. I told you to book the aisle seats. Do you ever listen? I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. The elderly couple behind us in line exchanged uncomfortable glances, and the businessman beside them suddenly found his phone very interesting. "Chris, please," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. The aisle seats were $300 more. I thought. You thought wrong. Again. He snatched his boarding pass from my hand with such force that the paper crumpled at the edges. This is exactly why we're in this mess, Ava. You think small. You act small. Everything about you is just small. The words hit me like physical blows. I'd been a high school English teacher for 8 years, and I'd heard cruel things from teenagers, but nothing had ever hurt like this. Nothing had ever felt so personal, so calculated to destroy. I saved for 6 months for this trip, I managed to say, my voice barely audible over the gate announcements. I wanted to do something special for us. For our anniversary. Chris laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made my stomach clench. Special? Economy seats on a red-eye flight is special? God. Ava, sometimes I wonder what I ever saw in you. The drizzle that had been threatening all morning finally began in earnest, drumming against the terminal windows. The weather matched my mood perfectly, gray, cold, and getting worse by the minute. I watched the raindrops race down the glass and felt something inside me breaking, piece by piece. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now boarding all passengers for Flight 447 to Honolulu, the gate agent announced cheerfully, oblivious to the domestic drama unfolding in her boarding area. I picked up my worn carry-on bag and started toward the gate, but Chris grabbed my arm. Not gently. Hard enough to leave marks. And another thing, he hissed in my ear, his breath hot against my skin. When we get to the hotel, don't embarrass me like you did at the Reynolds party. Try to act like you belong somewhere nice for once. The Reynolds party, where I'd accidentally used the wrong fork for the salad course, and Chris had spent the entire drive home explaining in excruciating detail how mortified he'd been. How I'd made him look like he'd married beneath him. I won't embarrass you, I whispered back, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. You already have. He released my arm and stepped back, looking at me like I was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. Look at you. Look at that ratty suitcase. Look at those cheap clothes. Do you know what people think when they see us together? I didn't answer. I couldn't. The truth was, I'd been asking myself the same question for months. What did people think when they saw us together? Did they wonder what someone like Chris, successful, handsome, charming, was doing with someone like me? The boarding process continued around us, families and couples chatting excitedly about their vacations while we stood there in our private bubble of misery. A little girl in line behind us was showing her mother the pictures she'd drawn of fish and dolphins, talking about all the sea creatures she hoped to see. Her mother smiled and kissed the top of her head, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Longing, maybe, for the kind of love that lifted you up instead of tearing you down. Final boarding call for Flight 447 to Honolulu. All remaining passengers should board now. Chris checked his watch, the expensive one his company had given him for closing the Morrison deal. Come on. I want to get to our seats before some tourist puts their oversized bag in our overhead space. But as we approached the gate, he stopped suddenly, turned to face me with an expression I'd never seen before. It was cold, yes, but there was something else there. Something final. You know what, Ava? I can't do this anymore. What? The word came out as barely a whisper. This. Us. Pretending like we're some happy couple going on a romantic getaway. Pretending like you haven't been a disappointment from day one. The other passengers were filing past us now, showing their boarding passes to the gate agent with smiles and excited chatter. Normal couples doing normal things. Living normal, happy lives. "Chris, please," I said, reaching for his hand. "We can work through this. That's why we're taking this trip, remember? To reconnect. To find our way back to each other." He pulled his hand away like my touch burned him. "There's no back to each other, Ava. There never was. I settled for you because I thought you'd be grateful. I thought you'd try harder. But you're just exactly what you appear to be. A small-town teacher with small-town dreams and absolutely nothing interesting about her." The gate agent was making another announcement, something about final boarding, but her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Everything felt distant and unreal, like I was watching this happen to someone else. "I'm getting on that plane," Chris said, adjusting his leather jacket, the one I'd given him for his birthday last year, saving up for 3 months to afford it. "You can follow me if you want, but I'm done pretending this marriage is anything more than a mistake." He turned toward the gate, and for a moment, I thought he might look back. Might realize what he was doing and remember the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The man who used to leave little notes in my lunch bag. Who used to say I was the smartest person he knew. Who used to look at me like I was something precious. But he didn't look back. I stood there, frozen, as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent and disappeared down the jetway. Just like that. 5 years of marriage, and he walked away without a backward glance. "Ma'am." The gate agent was looking at me with concern. "Are you boarding flight 447? I looked down at the boarding pass in my hand. "Seat 23B. Middle seat, just like Chris had complained about. Next to him. Next to the man who had just told me I was a disappointment and a mistake." I started to say, but the words wouldn't come. "Ma'am, I need to close the gate. Are you getting on the plane?" The rain was coming down harder now, and I could hear it drumming against the terminal roof. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the dark clouds gathering, promising a real storm. The kind that washes everything clean. "No," I said finally, my voice stronger than I expected. "No, I'm not getting on that plane." The gate agent nodded sympathetically and began shutting down her station. Within minutes, the boarding area was empty except for me and the janitor who'd started mopping the floors. I walked over to the windows and pressed my palm against the cool glass, watching the rain streak down in rivulets. My reflection stared back at me, a 32-year-old woman with sad eyes and a cheap dress, standing alone in an airport while her husband flew away to paradise without her. That's when I realized I still had our luggage. Both of our suitcases were sitting right there beside the gate, forgotten in the chaos of our fight. Chris had been so angry, so focused on making his point, that he'd left with nothing but his wallet and his boarding pass. I almost laughed. Almost. Here I was, abandoned and humiliated, and I was the one with the luggage. There was probably a metaphor in there somewhere, but I was too hurt to figure it out. The storm was getting worse, and I could see passengers from other flights pressing their faces to the windows, watching the lightning dance across the sky. The airport was starting to feel like a refuge, a safe space between the storm outside and the storm that was apparently my marriage. I needed to call someone. My sister, maybe. Or my friend Sarah from work. Someone who could pick me up and drive me home, where I could curl up on my couch and try to figure out how my life had fallen apart so completely. But first, I needed to get to my car. And to do that, I'd have to go outside, into the rain, with 2 suitcases and a broken heart. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and headed for the exit. Whatever happened next, I'd face it head on. I'd survived Chris's cruelty this long. I could survive whatever came after. I just didn't know yet that what came after would change everything. I was halfway to the taxi stand, my arms aching from dragging 2 suitcases through puddles that seemed to get deeper with every step, when I heard the purr of an expensive engine cutting through the storm. Not the usual sound of airport shuttles or hurried commuters. This was something else entirely. Something that whispered wealth and power, even over the howling wind. A sleek black Rolls-Royce glided up to the curb beside me, its pristine surface somehow untouched by the chaos of a storm. The car looked like it belonged in a movie, not in the real world, where people like me got abandoned in airport parking lots. For a moment, I thought it might be picking up some dignitary or celebrity, and I tried to step out of the way. But instead of continuing past me, the car stopped. Right there. Right in front of me. The engine idled with that particular quiet confidence that only comes with engineering perfection, and I found myself staring at my reflection in the tinted rear window. I looked like exactly what I was, a woman whose life had just fallen apart, standing in a storm with nowhere to go. Then the window rolled down. I expected to see a passenger, maybe someone who'd taken pity on the soaked woman struggling with luggage. Instead, I found myself looking at the driver, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention even from inside a car. But it wasn't his presence that made my breath catch in my throat. It was his face. I knew that face. Not recently, but I knew it. The strong jawline that matched my own. The deep-set eyes that looked exactly like the ones that stared back at me from my bathroom mirror every morning. The way his eyebrows lifted slightly when he was surprised, just like mine did. Just like my father's had, in those faded photographs Aunt Margaret had kept hidden away. Ava. His voice was cultured, warm, and completely bewildered. Ava Morgan? I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stand there in the rain, staring at a ghost from my childhood. Because that's what he was, Uncle Ellis. My father's brother, the man in the background of those few precious family photos I'd memorized as a child. Oh my God, he breathed, and suddenly he was getting out of the car, completely ignoring the storm that immediately began soaking his expensive suit. It really is you. I can't believe, after all these years. He stood there in the rain, studying my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for decades. And maybe he was. Maybe I was. Uncle Ellis? The words came out as barely a whisper, lost in the wind. His face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. Gone was the intimidating businessman, replaced by someone who looked like he'd just received the best news of his life. You remember me. He stepped closer, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears. I wasn't sure. You were so young when everything happened. When your mother... He trailed off, but I knew what he meant. When my mother had made whatever choice Aunt Margaret could never bring herself to explain. When doors had been closed and bridges had been burned, and a little girl had been cut off from half her family. I don't understand, I managed to say, my voice shaking from cold and shock and 26 years of unanswered questions. What are you doing here? How did you? The Foundation reports, he said simply. The Skyward Trust. Every year, you send us updates on your life. Photos, achievements, news about your career. I've been watching you grow up from a distance, Ava. Watching you become the remarkable woman your father always knew you'd be. The Skyward Trust. The anonymous scholarship that had paid for my education. The mysterious checks that had helped me through tough times. It hadn't been some random charity. It had been family. Family I'd never known was there. I started but couldn't finish. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was too big, too impossible to believe. CEO of Morgan Aviation, he said quietly. The company your father built from nothing. The empire he left behind when he died. Morgan Aviation. I'd heard the name before, seen it on planes at various airports, but I'd never connected it to my own last name. There were lots of Morgans in the world, after all. It had never occurred to me that one of the biggest airlines in the country might be named after my family. Might be my family. But why now? I asked, my mind reeling with questions. Why approach me now, after all these years? Ellis glanced around at the storm, at my soaked clothes and the suitcases I'd abandoned in the puddles behind me. Because you're standing in the rain, alone, and you look like your heart is breaking. And because I made a promise to your father 30 years ago that I'd look after you, if you ever needed it. He moved to the car and opened the rear door, gesturing for me to get in. Your father would never forgive me if I let you stand here like this. Hell, I'd never forgive myself. I hesitated, looking back at the terminal where Chris had disappeared, then at the suitcases full of a life that suddenly felt very small and far away. "Come on, Ava," Ellis said gently. "Let me take you somewhere warm and dry. Let me tell you about the father you never got to know and the legacy that's been waiting for you all these years." He snapped his fingers, and suddenly a uniformed driver appeared from nowhere, efficiently loading my wet suitcases into the trunk like they were precious cargo instead of cheap luggage from a discount store. As I slid into the leather interior of the Rolls-Royce, surrounded by luxury I'd never imagined, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life had just changed forever. The girl who'd been abandoned in the rain was about to discover she'd never been abandoned at all. The Rolls-Royce glided through the storm like it existed in a different world entirely. Inside, the leather seats were warm and soft, and the silence was broken only by the gentle hum of the engine and the distant sound of rain on the roof. It felt like being wrapped in a cocoon of luxury, completely separate from the chaos I'd left behind at the terminal. Ellis sat across from me, and now that I could see him clearly in the car's ambient lighting, the family resemblance was even more striking. He had the same hands as my father in those old photographs. Long fingers, strong palms, a way of holding himself that suggested he was used to being in control. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice still shaky from everything that had happened. "The executive lounge," Ellis said, his eyes never leaving my face. "Morgan Aviation has a private facility at the airport. Somewhere we can talk without interruption, and somewhere you can get out of those wet clothes." I looked down at my ruined dress, suddenly self-conscious. Everything about me felt shabby and small in comparison to the world I'd just entered. "I don't have anything else to wear. Everything's in the suitcases, and it's probably soaked through." Ellis smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he was used to solving problems before they became problems. "That's already been taken care of. My assistant is very efficient." The car pulled up to a building I'd never noticed before, despite flying out of this airport dozens of times over the years. It was elegant and understated, with no signs or markings to indicate what it was. Just a simple glass entrance with a uniformed attendant who opened the door before we'd even come to a complete stop. "Welcome back, Mr. Morgan," the attendant said with a respectful nod. Then his eyes moved to me, and I caught a flicker of curiosity. "And welcome, Miss Morgan." Miss Morgan, not Mrs. Peterson, which was what I'd been called for the past 5 years. Not ma'am or miss or any of the other generic terms I was used to. Miss Morgan, like I belonged here, like I'd been expected. The lobby was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Marble floors, fresh flowers that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum. Everything was designed to whisper wealth and power, but it was the kind of wealth that didn't need to shout. It simply was. "The third floor is ours," Ellis said as we stepped into an elevator that moved so smoothly I barely felt it. Executive offices, conference rooms, and a private lounge for VIP guests. "VIP guests like who?" I asked, still trying to process everything that was happening. "Heads of state, Fortune 500 CEOs, celebrities who need to travel discreetly." He paused, then added quietly, "Family members who've been away too long." The elevator opened onto a space that took my breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the airport, and I could see planes taking off and landing despite the storm. The furniture was a perfect blend of modern and comfortable, and there was a warmth to the space that made it feel less like an office and more like an elegant home. "The bathroom is through there," Ellis said, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. "You'll find everything you need." I pushed open the door and gasped. The bathroom was larger than my entire bedroom at home, with heated marble floors and a shower that looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. But it was the clothes hanging on the door that made me stop in my tracks. A designer dress in exactly my size, still with tags from a boutique I'd only ever walked past in the mall. Shoes that probably cost more than I made in a month. Undergarments that were somehow exactly what I would have chosen if I'd had unlimited money and exquisite taste. I showered quickly, washing away the rain and the humiliation of the day, and when I emerged in the borrowed clothes, I felt like a different person. The dress fit perfectly, hugging my curves in all the right places and making me feel elegant in a way I'd never experienced before. When I returned to the main room, Ellis was standing by the windows, looking out at the storm. He turned when he heard me, and his expression was one of wonder and sadness combined. "You look just like her," he said softly. "Just like your mother when she was your age." I joined him at the window, and we stood in silence for a moment, watching the lightning dance across the sky. Finally, I found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in my throat since I'd gotten in the car. "What happened, Uncle Ellis? What really happened between my parents and the family?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with years of regret. "Your father loved your mother more than life itself," he said. "But our family, we had expectations. Old money, old prejudices, old ideas about who was worthy of the Morgan name. Your mother was a teacher from a working-class family, and our parents couldn't see past that to the incredible woman she was. So they cut her off. They tried to, but your father chose love over legacy. He walked away from the family, took only what was legally his from the business, and built a life with your mother. For 6 years, they were happy. Completely, utterly happy. I felt tears stinging my eyes. And then they died. Car accident on I-75. Black ice, they said. Over in an instant." Ellis's voice broke slightly. "By the time I got to the hospital, you were already gone. Your aunt had taken you, and she made it very clear that she wanted nothing to do with the family that had rejected her sister." "But the foundation," I said. "The Skyward Trust. You've been watching over me all these years." He nodded. "It was the least I could do. Your father left instructions in his will. If anything happened to him and your mother, you were to be provided for, educated, protected. And when you were ready, when you chose to come back to the family, you would inherit everything that was rightfully yours." Everything. Ellis turned to face me fully, and I saw something in his eyes that made my heart race. "Ava, your father owned 47% of Morgan Aviation when he died. That stake has been held in trust for you for 26 years. With compound growth and reinvestment, it's now worth—" He paused, and I could see him calculating in his head. "Approximately $2.8 billion. The number hit me like a physical blow. I had to sit down, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "That's not possible. It's not just possible, Ava. It's yours. It's always been yours. You're not just Ava Morgan, the schoolteacher from Atlanta. You're Ava Morgan, heir to one of the largest airlines in the world." I stared at him, my mind reeling. This morning, I'd been a woman whose husband had abandoned her in the rain. Now I was sitting in a luxury lounge, wearing designer clothes, being told I was worth billions of dollars. "I need to call Chris," I said suddenly. "I need to tell him." "No." Ellis's voice was firm. "You don't need to tell him anything. The man who left you in the rain doesn't deserve to know who you really are." And as I sat there looking out at the storm that had brought me to this moment, I realized he was right. Chris had married me thinking I was ordinary, small, forgettable. He'd never bothered to ask about my family, my dreams, my past. He'd never bothered to ask who I really was. Now, finally, I was beginning to find out myself. "There's something else," Ellis said, checking his watch with a slight smile. "Flight 447 to Honolulu has been delayed due to the storm. They're bringing passengers back to the terminal." My heart skipped a beat. Chris is coming back. Among others, yes. "And I think it's time you met some of the people who work for you." Before I could ask what he meant, Ellis's phone buzzed. He answered it with a crisp yes, then listened for a moment before hanging up. "Perfect timing," he said, standing and smoothing his suit jacket. "The passengers are being transported back now. Shall we go welcome them?" I felt a flutter of nerves mixed with something I'd never experienced before, anticipation that felt almost predatory. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." "Ava," Ellis said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder, "you've been ready for this your entire life. You just didn't know it yet." We took the elevator down to the main terminal level, but instead of going through the usual passenger areas, Ellis led me through a series of corridors I'd never seen before. Staff members we passed nodded respectfully to him, and I noticed how their eyes lingered on me with curiosity. "Where are we going?" I asked as we walked down a carpeted hallway lined with photographs of aircraft and airport ceremonies. Gate 7. "It's our private gate for executive and VIP passengers," Ellis explained. "Flight 447 passengers are being brought there first for rebooking and accommodation arrangements." We emerged onto a section of tarmac I'd never seen from the passenger side. A sleek private jet sat nearby, its engines quietly humming, and I could see the Morgan Aviation logo gleaming on its side in elegant script. "Is that?" I started to ask. "Your jet," Ellis said simply. "Well, one of them. The company maintains a fleet for executive travel." "My jet." The words felt foreign in my mind, like trying on clothes that were too big. But as I looked at the aircraft, something stirred inside me. A sense of recognition, maybe, or destiny. That's when I saw the bus. A luxury coach was pulling up to the gate area, and through its windows, I could see the frustrated faces of Flight 447 passengers. Chris was in the third row, his expensive jacket wrinkled now, his usually perfect hair disheveled from the stress of the delayed flight. "Showtime," Ellis murmured, and I felt his hand on my back, guiding me toward the area where the passengers would disembark. The bus doors opened, and passengers began filing out, grumbling about the weather and the delay. I recognized several faces from the boarding area. The elderly couple who'd witnessed Chris's cruel comments, the businessman who'd pretended to be absorbed in his phone, the little girl who'd drawn pictures of dolphins. And then Chris stepped off the bus. He looked older somehow, worn down by hours of sitting in an airplane that couldn't take off. His eyes were scanning the area with the entitled impatience of someone who expected his problems to be solved immediately. That's when he saw me. For a moment, he looked confused, like he was seeing something that couldn't possibly be real. I was standing next to Ellis, wearing a dress that probably cost more than Chris made in a month, looking nothing like the bedraggled woman he'd left in the rain. "Ava," he called out, his voice uncertain. "What are you? How did you get here?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I watched as his eyes took in my appearance, the designer clothes, the professional styling, the way I carried myself with a confidence I'd never possessed before. I could see him trying to process what he was seeing, trying to reconcile this version of me with the woman he'd married. Ellis stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the area. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Ellis Morgan, CEO of Morgan Aviation. I apologize for the delay to your flight. We're working to get you rebooked on the next available departure." Several passengers murmured acknowledgments, but Chris was staring at Ellis with a strange expression. I could see the wheels turning in his head, putting together the name Morgan, the executive authority, and my presence beside him. "I'm particularly sorry that the weather has disrupted what should have been a pleasant anniversary trip," Ellis continued, his eyes finding Chris in the crowd. "I understand some of you were traveling with spouses who couldn't make the flight." Chris's face went pale. My wife, she missed the flight." "Did she?" Ellis asked with mild interest. "How unfortunate. I hope she wasn't left stranded somewhere." I could see Chris struggling to understand what was happening. His eyes kept darting between Ellis and me, and I could practically hear him trying to work out the connection. "Actually," Ellis said casually, "I'd like you all to meet someone. This is Ava Morgan, my niece and the primary shareholder of Morgan Aviation." The words hit the group like a thunderbolt. The elderly couple who'd witnessed Chris's earlier cruelty turned to stare at me with wide eyes. The businessman's phone finally had his full attention as he looked up in shock. But it was Chris's reaction that I'd remember for the rest of my life. His mouth literally fell open. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally, a dawning horror as he realized what he'd done. What he'd walked away from. What he'd thrown away in his arrogance and cruelty. "That's impossible," he whispered, but his voice carried in the sudden silence. "Ava's just a teacher. She's nobody special." The words hung in the air like a slap, and I felt every person in that area react to them. The elderly woman actually gasped. The businessman shook his head in disgust. Ellis's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a chill that could have frozen the storm outside. Interesting choice of words, Mr. Peterson. Not many men would refer to their wife as nobody special, particularly when speaking about the heir to a multi-billion-dollar aviation empire. Chris's knees actually buckled slightly. He reached out to steady himself against the bus, his face now completely white. "Ava," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't know. You never told me. We can work this out. This doesn't change anything between us." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. This man who had spent 5 years making me feel small, worthless, embarrassing. This man who had abandoned me in a storm because he thought I wasn't good enough for him. "You're right, Chris," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed area. "This doesn't change anything between us. You married someone you thought was ordinary, and you treated her accordingly. The fact that you were wrong about who I am doesn't change who you are." I moved closer to Ellis, feeling the warmth of family and belonging for the first time in my adult life. "The only thing this changes," I continued, "is that now I have the resources to make sure I never have to settle for being treated like I'm nobody special ever again." Chris opened his mouth to say something else, but Ellis cut him off with a gesture. "Mr. Peterson, you'll be rebooked on tomorrow's flight to Honolulu. First class, of course, compliments of Morgan Aviation. Consider it a wedding gift." The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Chris was getting the luxury treatment he'd always craved, but only after he'd thrown away something infinitely more valuable. As we walked away, leaving Chris standing alone beside the bus with his mouth still hanging open, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt powerful. 3 months later, I stood in the penthouse suite of the Meridian Hotel in downtown Atlanta, looking out at the city skyline that now held an entirely different meaning for me. The hotel was one of many properties in the Morgan Aviation portfolio, and this particular suite had become my temporary home while I learned to navigate my new reality. The rain had stopped weeks ago, but I still thought about that storm every day. How it had washed away everything I thought I knew about myself and revealed something extraordinary underneath. Something that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment to emerge. My phone buzzed on the marble coffee table, and I glanced at the screen. Sarah, my former teaching colleague, was texting again, asking when I was coming back to work. She still didn't understand why I'd taken such an extended leave of absence, and I hadn't found the right way to explain that the woman who had taught English literature at Jefferson High School was never coming back. That woman had been abandoned in the rain. This woman, the one standing in a penthouse suite wearing a power suit that cost more than my old annual salary, was someone entirely different. The elevator chimed, and Ellis walked in, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd just closed a major deal. "The Tokyo expansion is approved," he said, settling into one of the plush armchairs. The board was unanimous. Apparently, having a Morgan back at the helm has given everyone renewed confidence in our international ventures. I turned from the window, still amazed at how naturally the business side of things had come to me. 3 months of intensive education in aviation economics, corporate governance, and strategic planning, and I felt like I'd been born for this world. "What about the environmental initiative?" I asked, joining him in the seating area. "That was the real victory," Ellis said with pride. "Your proposal for the carbon-neutral fleet conversion passed with full funding. $20 billion over 5 years to make Morgan Aviation the world's first completely green airline. It was my first major contribution to the company, and the one I was most proud of. Using my position to push for meaningful environmental change felt like honoring both my parents, my father's business acumen, and my mother's teaching values." "There's something else," Ellis said, his tone shifting slightly. "The legal team finished processing your divorce papers." I felt a small flutter in my stomach. Even though I'd initiated the proceedings, even though I knew it was the right decision, the finality of it still carried weight. "And," I prompted. "Chris fought the prenup initially. His lawyer tried to argue that your new financial status should entitle him to a larger settlement." Ellis's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the disgust in his eyes. "But But a prenup is a prenup, and he signed it willingly 5 years ago. He gets exactly what was agreed upon then, $50,000 and no claim to any assets acquired during the marriage. Ellis paused, then added with dark satisfaction, his lawyer dropped the case when we pointed out that technically, you owned those assets before the marriage. You just didn't know it. $50,000. It seemed like such a small amount now, but I remembered when that number would have represented freedom to me. Now it was barely a rounding error in my quarterly dividend payments. How did he take it? I asked, though I wasn't sure. I really wanted to know. Badly, from what I understand. He's been calling the office daily, asking to speak with you. Something about working things out, starting over, how he's learned from his mistakes. Ellis's voice dripped with disdain. Security has been instructed not to put his calls through. I nodded, feeling nothing but relief. The man who had told me I was nobody special wanted to reconcile now that he knew I was worth billions. The irony was almost funny, if it wasn't so pathetic. There's one more thing, Ellis said, reaching into his portfolio. The foundation board approved your proposal. He handed me a document with the official letterhead of the Skyward Trust. I scanned it quickly, feeling a surge of excitement as I read the details. The Ava Morgan Scholarship Program, I read aloud. Full educational funding for children who've lost parents, regardless of financial background or family connections. Starting with an endowment of $50 million, Ellis added. Enough to support 500 students annually. I felt tears pricking my eyes. This was what I'd wanted to do from the moment I learned about my inheritance. Use my resources to help kids like I'd been. Kids who might be overlooked or forgotten, who needed someone to believe in their potential. Your Aunt Margaret would be proud, Ellis said softly. I hope so, I whispered. I hope they both would be. My phone buzzed again, and this time it was a news alert. I glanced at it out of habit and felt my eyebrows raise in surprise. What is it? Ellis asked, noticing my expression. I turned the phone toward him. The headline read, Local teacher turned aviation heiress announces major environmental initiative. Below it was a photo of me from the board meeting earlier that week, looking confident and professional in a way that still sometimes surprised me. The woman in that photo bore little resemblance to the one who'd been left crying in the rain 3 months ago. You've become quite the media darling, Ellis observed with amusement. Forbes wants to do a cover story. They're calling you the reluctant billionaire. Reluctant seems wrong, I said, looking back out at the city. I'm not reluctant anymore. I'm grateful. And I was grateful for the storm that had brought me to this moment. Grateful for a husband who'd shown me his true colors before I wasted any more years trying to be small enough for his world. Grateful for family I'd never known existed, and for the chance to honor my parents' memory by building something meaningful. My reflection in the window showed a woman I was still getting to know, poised, powerful, purposeful. The rain had washed away the person I'd been pretending to be and revealed the person I was always meant to become. As the sun set over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, I made myself a promise. I would never again settle for being treated as less than I was worth. I would never again make myself smaller to fit into someone else's limited vision of who I should be. The girl who'd been abandoned in the rain was gone forever. In her place stood Ava Morgan, heir to an aviation empire, protector of the environment, champion of forgotten children, and author of her own extraordinary story. And I was just getting started.